Good. Well, thanks everybody. I gotta go kind of quick here, so we're behind the schedule. So I'm gonna just run through a few things. As a wolf biologist, I'm mostly going to be talking to you about wolf biology. So what I wanted to present to you are really two things. So first, thinking of wolves as a predator, how do they go about the landscape? How do they hunt? And what makes their potential prey vulnerable, including your livestock? And some things to be thinking about when you're out there to kind of reduce that vulnerability. And there's going to be some recurring themes. Of course, we're going over things, we're harping on you about things all day. The one thing in particular I'll be talking about in the second part of my presentation is removing those attractants that you might have on your property or your allotment that might influence whether or not wolves are going to be in that area. So just starting with basic predator-prey relationship. It's important to just think about, prey are out there, they're interacting with predators, they've been doing this for a long time. They're co-evolving. So both the predator and the prey are developing strategies to help them survive. And for me, I kind of think of it as an arms race. These different species are out there interacting, they're competing, and you have to develop successful survival strategies or you're not going to be around very long. There's an awful lot of species that have existed at some point in time, they're not here anymore because they had bad strategies. It's also important to remember that prey in general, they're not really defenseless because they're developing those strategies. The caveat to that is as long as those prey can use the innate survival tools they've developed. They have to be in a situation that they can use those tools. And an example of that would just be a mountain goat. If you have a mountain goat up on a rocky ledge, that's a pretty safe animal. They're developed to live up there. They can get away from most predators in that environment. You grab that mountain goat, you stick it down to valley bottom, it's probably not going to do too well. It's not developed to live in that environment. The predator is the same way. There are different strategies that are used for different species. If you look at a cougar, it's what you call an ambush predator. It's physically developed to sneak up on an animal, grab it, and kill it, generally by itself. Wolves are different. You probably heard the term earlier, a coursing predator. So what is a coursing predator? It's a predator that travels around actively looking for prey. And in the case of wolves, we've been saying this kind of all day too, they generally need the prey to run. They're built to go after a running prey species and bite it and kill it. Wolves are smart, they're opportunistic, they're generalists, they can live in a lot of different areas, they can hunt a lot of different types of species, and they're constantly evolving their techniques to cope with whatever challenges they're faced with, and that's what's challenging about them. Now on the prey side of things, you've got a couple options. So the first is to flee. You see a predator, you run away from it, and it's kind of logic. What you'd expect when this would happen would be if you have fast, nimble prey, snowshoe hares, caribou, deer, elk in certain situations, they're going to run from a predator. It's not just how that prey animal is built, though, that affects whether or not this strategy is going to work. It depends on other factors. Are there weak individuals within the herd? Is the terrain sufficient to allow you to run away? Is there a good closing distance, or did that animal, that predator, get very close to the herd before the herd was aware of it? All those things are going to play into whether or not fleeing from a predator is going to be an effective strategy. And then you have prey species that are going to turn and face the predator. They're ready to fight, and they're not going to move off. It's typically the larger and slower animals. You see muskox do this, moose, bison, elk occasionally. And that, with the elk especially, an animal that normally might flee can be put in a situation where it's going to turn and fight if the conditions are such that it can't do that. And for the predator, they're looking for that running response. That's what they want. We were talking about it before. This is just showing you some pictures of the attack locations for wolves. So they try to get them running, and then they're going to be biting at the hindquarters primarily, or in the armpits on the front legs. And there's a good reason for that. When a prey animal is running, they're not looking behind them. They're not able to aim their hooves very well. So attacking those areas is safer for the wolves. If they're dealing with an animal like this bison here that's standing its ground, they're going to try to get it to run, because this is a risky situation for wolves. There's been a lot of work on wolf-prey interactions in Yellowstone. Some of the data from there, when wolves encounter elk, their hunting success is about 20%. With bison, it was only about 7%. And so that's probably because about 75% of the time that wolves interacted with bison, the bison didn't run away. It faced the wolf and was ready to fight. And if the bison wouldn't run away, that puts the wolf in a pretty risky position. A bison is a big animal, as are cows. An animal that size that decides to fight back, the wolves are actually in a pretty vulnerable position. And wolves have been killed by pretty much every species of wild ungulate we have in North America, and by some domestic species as well. Some research on how often that happens. So there's been work done in Alaska that looked at wolf injuries, and specifically the injuries that were caused by their hunting activities. And what they did was they took 112 wolves where they had the carcass, and they did a full necropsy to look for major injuries on that animal that might have come from hunting activities. And what they found were there were pretty significant fractures or other bone injuries in about 39% total of those wolves. So about 1 in 3, a little bit better than 1 in 3 wolves that had a serious injury accounted for by its hunting activities. And if you looked at older wolves, it was even more prevalent. It was about 60% of the wolves had pretty serious injuries associated with them. Now, an older animal has had more time to accumulate those injuries, so that's one reason. But another reason for that is probably that, in general, it's the older wolves that do most of the hunting. What you'll find in a pack, it's the experienced animals, and a lot of times the males, that are doing the most dangerous work on bringing an animal down. So they're the ones that are most at risk. So for a wolf, you're constantly having to weigh these decisions as you're moving about the landscape, and it really is a life or death decision. What's the risk and what's the benefit? Am I going to get food today, or am I going to get kicked in the head and die? And a prey animal standing ground equates to a higher risk for the wolf when it's weighing these options. Wolves learn from their parents. They learn from an early age that they need to become experts at quickly calculating that risk when they encounter prey, and they become really exceptional at sensing vulnerability. And what vulnerability means I'll get into in a few minutes here, because there's some important distinctions to make there with whether or not an animal is vulnerable to predation. So I just want to quickly go through here a hunt sequence. So typically how a wolf hunt goes. As a coursing predator, the first stage in this is the search. So wolves are traveling large distances. We've talked about that with dispersal, but it's certainly true for an established pack as well. They're relying on just chance, as well as their senses to pick up the trail of a prey animal. And that means they may travel really long distances between successful hunts, and they may do so quite quickly. So what's a strategy for survival if you're a prey animal and you know that you're dealing with a coursing predator? Your spacing and movement would be one of the things you could change. So if you imagine a caribou herd like we have here in Alaska, you have these huge groups of animals that are constantly moving around the landscape. And so it might take wolves weeks just to locate that group. Since they don't just follow one herd, it could take a really long time. It was the same with bison on the Great Plains. Now if you think about Oregon, what we're dealing with, you're typically dealing with elk in smaller groups, but those smaller groups are rarely in one place for very long. And because of that, it becomes harder for the wolf to locate animals on a reliable basis. Now if we focus on livestock and the search part of the hunt sequence for wolves, what does that mean for you? Typically with livestock, you encourage your cows to kind of spread out on pasture, but there's one thing I want you to just think about as a possibility. So here I have my terrible graphics that I did, my graphic design. You'll be very impressed. Thank you. Just very simply thinking about, what if you stocked one pair of cattle per 100 acres on a 1,000-acre pasture and you're spreading them out? It's going to look something like this, right? Now if we add some other native animals on the landscape, we've got a wolf and we've got some elk in the landscape. Now that wolf doesn't have to go very far to interact with a cow. It could come across a cow and her calf pretty easily. And it's really more likely that it's going to interact with one of those cows before it finds the elk. There are other options that you might have out there depending on how much property you're dealing with. So another option would be here, we've got the same density. We've got a 1,000-acre pasture, we've got our 10 pairs, but what if the herd were together and then you're moving them around the pasture over time? It might take up to 10 times as long for the wolf now to find those cows as it would in the other stocking situation. It's just making it a little bit more likely that the wolf's going to interact with its native prey before it encounters the cows. It also means that your cows are in a more defensible herd, and we'll get into that a little bit now and a lot more later when Cameron talks to you. So we've gone through our search. What's the second thing that happens here? So now the wolves have encountered some prey, there's some elk there. They're going to approach and watch. They're great observers. So what they're going to do is they're going to study. They're going to study the situation. Is there a vulnerable animal there? Are they in a vulnerable position? Is there deep snow nearby? Are they about to cross a river? Is this a situation I've been in before when I was hunting and was successful somehow? What did I do to be successful? And the key is, that vulnerability, that wolves are going to exploit weakness. And that vulnerable could mean different things. It could mean a physical characteristic. So you got some pictures there of some different injuries. They can pick up an individual that was, sick, they're injured, they're old. It's a late-born fawn. But it could be something else too. You could have a healthy individual, but it's more physically vulnerable for some reason, like a young of a year. It's not as fast. It's probably not as smart yet. It's otherwise healthy, but it might not make as good of decisions. So there are the other situations too, though. You'll certainly hear people talk about situations where they found a wolf kill. It was a huge bull, a healthy cow. That doesn't sound like a vulnerable animal. But you have to remember that vulnerability doesn't just mean physical characteristics. It means the situation too. So there's usually some kind of situation that made that otherwise healthy animal vulnerable to a wolf. It could have been the ground cover. It could be that the animal had no idea wolves were around, and then it was suddenly set upon and killed. It could have been alone instead of with the herd, and so it was singled out. And it could be a bad decision that the animal made, and that certainly happens. This is a case of that here. So we've got this otherwise healthy bull, but it made a bad decision. And in this case, what happened was there were actually two bulls that were being chased by the wolves, and this bull dove off into really heavy snow. It got bogged down. And so the vulnerability then was that this animal couldn't move through that snow and the wolves could. You can see here a perfect example of the attack locations again. You've got wolves working that hind end, and you got that one going for the armpit, and that's really characteristic. I wanted to touch briefly on the idea of surplus killing, because you hear about that too, and it is kind of an interesting phenomenon to look at. And it's been seen in a lot of different species, and that's kind of why I wanted to bring it up. And so what we believe happens when you have a situation where wolves kill kind of an inordinate amount of animals at once is probably because hunting is so dangerous. We talked about this risk-benefit analysis that wolves typically have to do. So that means that a predator will exploit weakness to the full extent they can, because sometimes they're not going to have that weakness available. So if prey are unusually vulnerable for some reason, you get these cases of what you call surplus killing, where wolves or another predator will continue to kill animals as they're available beyond what they can eat, certainly in one sitting. And biologists don't believe this is a malicious thing, that it's what you would call sport killing necessarily. It's really they're using their survival strategy while they can do it. And in a lot of cases, you will see that the wolves will come back and cache some of this and come back and eat it later, or another predator will as well. But they might not always. But this is not a phenomenon that's only been seen in wolves. It's been documented in a lot of different predators. Weasels, bears, coyotes, fox, raccoons, lions, domestic dogs, spiders, some other predators. And it's something to be keeping in mind, though, if you're dealing with something like sheep or turkeys or situations like that, where you have a very vulnerable animal that doesn't have a lot of innate survival ability. If those animals interact with a predator and don't have the right defensive strategies in place, something like this is likely to happen. In situations where you have vulnerable sheep and you don't have the right defensive strategies in place, you almost always have more than one kill. It's the same with, I mentioned turkeys because I came from Wisconsin before I came here, and that was one of our biggest one-time event depredations with wolves. Was a turkey facility where the wolf got inside of that enclosure and I think killed something like 100 turkeys. And really you'll see that with pretty much any predator, that as long as that vulnerable prey is in front of them and easy to catch, they just can't turn off that switch. They're going to keep killing while they're able to do that. So what does that mean for livestock when wolves are approaching them? So the wolf's going to do the same thing when it comes to a herd of cattle as it would do if it came to a herd of elk. It's going to watch and it's going to look for weaknesses. So what is the wolf potentially going to see? Any cows sick with larkspur poisoning, or any of them limping, have hoof rot, or any of the calves coughing as there's scours in the herd. Any bawling, are there any calves off by themselves that are vulnerable because the mother's not nearby? And so any of those things, if they're occurring in your herd, are making animals vulnerable, and the wolves are going to pick up on that. So it really is vitally important that you're out there and monitoring your livestock for these other factors, because it's not just wolves themselves that are making your livestock potentially vulnerable. It's the situation that those livestock are in, it's their health, it's a lot of different factors. Okay, I gotta keep moving quick here. That's 16 minutes. So the third thing that's going to happen here is the rush group. So we've evaluated the prey, we've looked for weakness, we've sighted in on something that we think is vulnerable. Now we're going to rush them and try to get them to run. And once they're running, we're going to actually attack them. So I mentioned this already. Strategies for survival. A lot of species use this herding and grouping behavior. Make yourself less vulnerable for a number of reasons. One would be dilution of risk. So if there's 100 of you, it's less likely that you're the one that's going to get targeted than if there's only 10 of you. There's greater physical defense because you have multiple animals fighting back against the wolves. It does some other things too. You'll see in the literature fancy terms like optimal foraging vigilance ratio. All that means is that you've got a lot of eyes, basically. There's more time for each individual to eat because you've got more other individuals that can be looking for predators. And as far as elk versus caribou or something, those are kind of different strategies where you can either be a small herd that reduces the likelihood that you're going to be found, but if found you're more vulnerable, or a large herd that has a higher likelihood of being found because you're such a big herd, but there's much more dilution of risk for each individual. So there's different ways that different species deal with that. Talking about cattle, they really are pretty similar to bison, so you kind of want them to act the same way. They've got this large size, they like to be in a herd. You want these animals to stand their ground. They're a formidable animal if that cow is going to stand her ground with her calf and not run. Okay, so focusing now on livestock and that idea of the cow standing her ground. I said it already, wolves are going to test the cows just like they would test the elk or bison. Wolves are going to harass them, they're going to come in close, they're going to try to get them moving. And if they can get them riled up, it might only take that one cow to start moving, which might get the whole herd starting to go, and then you've got a problem. Or if they're not mothered up, you get a couple calves bawling, and now the wolves are aware that there's that vulnerability there. So what you really want is you want confident cows that bunch up when approached by a potential predator and don't run. And that is one thing I'll mention as something to consider, and I think Cameron's going to get into more details about this. But with a herding dog, to a cow, there might not be a whole lot of difference when it's looking at a herding dog and looking at a wolf. They're both canines. So it is important when you're thinking about how your dogs are interacting with your livestock. You don't want a situation where your cattle are terrified of your dog either. If they're running away from the herding dog because of the way that they're moved across the landscape, it's pretty likely that when they interact with a wolf, they're going to run from it too, and that's really what you don't want. Okay, the wolves have rushed the group. They're targeting an individual now. They're picking out that vulnerable individual. This is kind of the stage of the hunt that it's most dangerous for the wolf. This is where they might get kicked in the head. They might fall and hurt themselves. It's a lot of energy expenditure. They're in a full-out run now. They're trying to take this animal down. And if we're focusing again on livestock, what that looks like is that the target individual stage, in a lot of cases, they can kind of skip some of these other stages, because a lot of times what happens, we think, is that a wolf never has to rush a group because they find a calf alone. So mothering up again is super important. If they do find a cow and calf, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to test it and try to get the mother to run. If all your cows and calves are healthy though, and they're standing their ground as a herd, it's a lot more likely that no individual is going to get targeted, because it's just a risky situation and the wolf is more likely to try to find a better option. Doesn't mean it's always going to happen, but that's certainly what we're trying to move towards. And then our final stage here is the capture. They actually take the animal down and bite it until it dies. One kind of interesting thing we've seen with some of our depredations in Oregon is that we actually have seen quite a fair number of wolf injured calves, not just killed. And what we think is happening there is that you probably did have a pretty decent mother cow, that the wolves probably encountered a cow-calf pair off by themselves, attacked, and were able to grab onto that calf and start attacking it, but the mother did come to its defense and actually prevented the calf from being killed. Now, a lot of cases, those injuries are severe enough that eventually that calf has to be put down. But I would argue that at least in that situation, it's still better than if the wolf had killed the calf, because what you've done at least is you've shown the wolf that there's risk here. That mother came to the defense. There was no real reward. They didn't get to eat. They might have gotten hurt, and it's probably less likely in those scenarios that wolf's going to try doing this again. I did want to talk briefly on these removing attractants, because I do think this is just vitally important, because this is a proactive step that you can take now. You don't need to have wolves on the landscape. And we're talking about bone piles and carcasses. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a bone pile or a carcass pile. It's the way things have been done for a long time. It's just once you have predators, and in particular wolves on the landscape, you need to start thinking about changing the way things are done, because at that point, it really does affect the risk of your cattle, and that's because people have mentioned already, wolves are smart. They're not just a predator, they're a scavenger. If I can find easy food without risking getting kicked in the face by an elk, why not do that? So once wolves find a reliable food source, they're going to keep going back to it. So I would argue that carcass removal is probably the most important method you have to prevent future livestock depredation. Especially near calving pastures and for smaller producers. And just some quick examples here of what this looks like on the landscape. So OR44, I think we've seen some of his dispersal before. This is a wolf that we had collared and watched the dispersal. You'll see here during that dispersal there are 3 groups of points. So the first group of points there near La Grande is when it was trying to cross I-84. So it was scared. It took a while to figure out how to get across the highway. It eventually did. Then you can see very quickly moved west, and then we have another group of points there north of Bend, and then another one further north. So what's interesting is looking at what happened at those other 2 points. And what happened was at that first group of points north of Bend there is that the wolf found a dried cow carcass, stopped there to feed. If you're a dispersing wolf, you're hunting by yourself, you don't know the landscape you're in, it's hard to find food. So these dispersers especially, it's very likely that they're going to go to a food source if they find one. So it spent some time at that cow carcass and then started to head north. It was a little bit west of the Dalles for about 11 days, and then it started to head south again after some time. Eventually went to California. We lost contact with the collar, so we don't know what ultimately happened to OR44. But what happened at that spot west of the Dalles was that the wolf found a large bone pile, and it was from a mobile slaughtering operation, and it was big. You could see it on Google Earth, and it was about 70 by 30 yards. So there was a lot of material there to attract the wolf in. And the issue with that was that there was a livestock producer that was just west of that bone pile that was starting to calve. So now you've got kind of a worst case scenario. This wolf probably wouldn't have stopped there and spent so much time if that food hadn't been there. But now you've got the food there. Now you've got this wolf observing these young calves. It's not a great situation. ODFW staff went out there and tried to haze the wolf away, but the wolf was never there when the biologist went out there. And that's something I'll mention as an issue with collars, because a lot of times we hear a lot from producers and other folks that we just need to collar more wolves. We want all the wolves collared. And we do have quite a few wolves collared right now. I think we're tracking maybe 23, 24. But that's out of a population last winter of 137 or so. It's just really difficult to do that. There's all sorts of challenges. It's hard to catch a wolf. It's expensive. It's potentially dangerous for us to do helicopter capture. Once you catch a wolf, the collars are not super reliable. So they're supposed to last for several years. They might last for 2 days, and then they die, and we never know what happened to the animal. And then even in a best case scenario, if we get a collar out, now we've got one animal collared in a pack. If that pack's 8 or 9 animals, that pack's not always together, especially at different seasons. So you're really getting kind of a limited amount of information on that pack. And then even if you have multiple collars in a pack, and the collars are working. When they're working, that's not real-time data. So that's the other issue, is that we can't tell you right now a wolf is in that pasture or cabin. What usually happens is we'll get the backlogs of data and we can tell you 2 days ago that wolf was within 100 yards of operation. Well, that doesn't do you a ton of good. Now today you had a depredation. We couldn't necessarily prevent that just from the radio collar data. So there is good information. We get really good information on territorial boundaries and seasonally where wolves are spending a lot of time, and we can use that to kind of guide your grazing operations. But you got to remember that this isn't real-time data where we can just tell you where a wolf is at any given time. Okay, so then quickly with OR44, he didn't stop coming to that bone pile until we ultimately buried it. We sent some equipment out there, we buried the carcass, and the wolf left. And we got lucky, there never were any depredations there, but certainly with the calving that had been going on, that was a risk. And if we had never known that wolf was there from that radio collar data, it's possible that the wolf would have stayed there and eventually there would have been a problem with the producer. Really quickly, because this is really interesting too, I'm sure you've heard of all the problems that happened in Wallowa County. A lot of it revolved around the Naha pack. So this is another situation where bone pile removal really changed the behavior of these wolves. So what we have here is we've got the Wallowa Valley, where you see Joseph and Enterprise there. So a large number of cows are wintered down in there. There's an elk fence, so there's not a lot of native prey. There's some deer. That's about it. The Zumwalt Prairie there in the northern section, that's an area that's a major wintering area for elk. And then in the summer, the elk travel mostly south into the mountains where you see the Wolfpack summer range. So what we learned there was that we got a collar out on OR4. It was a breeding male of that pack in 2010. And it didn't take very long at all, and we started noticing that he was going down in the valley in areas that we wouldn't expect him to go because there was no elk, and spending a lot of time at those 4 locations that are on the map. So we go out to those 4 locations and we learn that there are large carcass pits that multiple operators are using at all 4 of those sites. And now again, there's nothing wrong with using those carcass pits, but now you've got a wolf on the landscape. It's become an attractant. It's taking the wolf out of an area that you normally would expect it to be and putting it in an area with a large amount of risk. The pack kept going and visiting those bone piles all through the winter. They would also visit the carcasses, they would do it at night. They were starting to be seen during the day. They weren't really going out in the Zumwalt Prairie anymore to hunt elk. And that yellow area is showing it's another attractant that they started to go to as well. It was slaughter waste that was being put out for dogs. At one point in March, a rancher went out in the middle of the night and hazed a wolf out of the stockyard after his dogs were barking. And it just goes to show you that the wolves were becoming more and more used to that food source. They were interacting with the cows more. They were also getting more used to people. They're interacting, they're getting around houses, they're hearing equipment, they're seeing vehicles. It's all becoming stuff that's becoming an accustomed part of their activity. And so then the first confirmed depredation we had down in that valley was in May of that year. And we ended up having quite a few of them. So what happened was in the summer that year, we cleaned up the bone piles. The producers worked with ODF&W, we got all 6 cleaned up. The county commissioners of Wallowa County set up a program where producers could take the stock to the local dump for free. Or they buried them. And this system only worked because the livestock producers were really vigilant about doing this and working with us to get it cleaned up. So once they were cleaned up, what did that look like? Well, we put some more collars out on the wolves so that we could look at and compare their locations from 2010 to 2011. And it really was quite stark. In 2010, when we had the bone piles, a little more than half the locations were within 3 miles of those piles down in the valley. And you can see almost 20% were very close to those piles and to those operators. In 2011, it just completely shifted. Less than 10% within 3 miles and almost none within 500 yards of the sites. There just was nothing to eat there anymore. There's no reason to go down there. Depredations, so a lot of those depredations in the year with the bone piles were happening adjacent to those bone piles. In 2011, not so much. Now the caveat to that is that there still were depredations. So I can't tell you for sure that just because you clean up a bone pile, now there's no risk for depredation. What I can tell you is there's really large differences in how the wolves are going to use the landscape. And if by removing those bone piles that are near your livestock, you're making it much less likely the wolves are going to be in the same area at the same time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're never going to develop the behavior to depredate, but you're just really lowering your risk that they're ever going to interact with your cattle, and that can be all it takes sometimes. So that is really all I had. I think I got to stop here.
Thank you, guys.